When people talk about a possible American ground war with Iran, they almost always start with the wrong question. They ask, can the United States win? That question sounds serious. It sounds strategic. It sounds like the language of realism. But it is the wrong question, and in wars like this, the wrong question is how countries talk themselves into catastrophe. Because the real question is not whether American forces could win the opening battles. They probably could. The real question is whether those early victories would mean anything once the United States stepped into a battlefield designed to punish power at every level. The real question is whether an army can enter Iran without getting dragged into a conflict that becomes harder to supply, harder to justify, harder to contain, and harder to escape with every passing week. That is the real issue. That is the real danger. And that is the heart of this argument. Iran is not simply another target on a war planner's map. It is a trap. A trap built not on slogans, but on structure. The trap is geography. The trap is logistics. The trap is politics. And once those pressures begin reinforcing one another, even a military superpower can find itself burning strength without producing the victory it promised. The source material makes that point clearly. The danger is not that the United States would fail to win battles. The danger is that it could win battles and still lose the war that actually matters. The strategic war, the political war, the war of endurance. Start with the first fact that should destroy any fantasy of a quick campaign. Iran is enormous. It is more than 1.6 million square kilometers, larger than Iraq and Afghanistan combined, with over 85 million people, large urban centers, remote villages, deserts, mountains, and a professional military backed by a deep historical memory of foreign invasion. That is not a side detail. That is the warning label. Scale in war is never just about distance on a map. Scale means time, scale means manpower, scale means cost, scale means more roads to protect, more fuel to move, more equipment to repair, more troops to sustain, and more political patience to consume. A country that large does not just absorb attack, it absorbs the invader's time, attention, money, and credibility. And that is why comparisons to Iraq in 2003 are so dangerously misleading. Iraq is the wrong analogy. The image of tanks racing forward, the capital falling, and the war being effectively won in a few weeks does not translate to Iran. The source text is explicit on that point, and it is right to be. Iran is larger, harder, more populated, more geographically punishing, and more prepared for the possibility of invasion. And a society with that kind of scale and historical memory does not automatically crumble under foreign attack. In many cases, outside pressure hardens resistance. It gives the state a cause bigger than ideology, survival. Then comes the question that wrecks simplistic war talk almost immediately. How does the invasion even begin? Armies do not appear by magic in the middle of hostile territory. They need ports, airfields, depots, repair systems, medical infrastructure, command centers, transport hubs, fuel storage, and massive logistical staging areas. Before a war can be fought, it has to be built. And building a war against Iran is exactly where the fantasy begins to collapse. The file points out that the United States cannot simply teleport 500,000 soldiers into the center of Iran. Those forces have to be deployed somewhere first, and the options are deeply constrained. Iraq is politically tied to Iran in ways that make its use as a launch platform highly unstable. Turkey has its own strategic interests and little reason to volunteer its territory for a war that could bring retaliation and instability to its doorstep. That leaves Gulf bases and naval assets, real assets certainly, but also exposed assets dependent on vulnerable sea lanes and regional infrastructure. And this is where serious strategy parts company with hollow bravado. Military power is not just the power to strike, it is the power to sustain the strike, to feed it, to fuel it, to repair it, to protect it, to keep it moving after the speeches are over. That is why logistics sits at the center of this entire argument. Every modern soldier depends on food, water, ammunition, spare parts, batteries, medicine, communication systems, fuel, and transport networks that function continuously under pressure. Once those chains begin to fray, the image of overwhelming force begins fraying with them. Iran does not need to defeat the United States in one grand conventional showdown. It only needs to make the battlefield so painful, so costly, and so politically unbearable that the invading force starts to lose momentum, then confidence, then the will to continue. That is exactly how the source frames Iran's likely strategy. That is the logic of attritional warfare. It is not glamorous. It does not rely on dramatic battlefield victory. It relies on corrosion, slow the convoys, threaten the choke points, harass the shipping lanes, force rerouting, force delays, force shortages, force uncertainty. Once uncertainty enters logistics, it infects everything else. Fuel arrives late, repair cycles slow down, supply plans become riskier, operational tempo weakens, morale deteriorates, and once morale begins to slip, even highly advanced military equipment cannot fully compensate for the human fact that war becomes harder to endure when the system behind you starts to wobble. The file is especially strong here because it reminds us that logistics is not background to war. Logistics is the bloodstream of war. Then comes the most merciless force in the entire presentation. That's RT terrain. So geography in this case is not backdrop, it is a weapon. The source emphasizes the Zagros Mountains in the west and the Alborz Range in the north. These are not minor obstacles. These are vast defensive systems made up of steep slopes, narrow valleys, harsh weather, high ground, limited maneuver corridors, and countless natural choke points. Heavy mechanized forces do not glide through this kind of terrain. They get channeled, forced onto predictable roads, compressed into movement patterns that defenders can anticipate. And on a battlefield, predictability is lethal. Picture the convoy entering a mountain pass. There's no room to fan out, no room to improvise, no room to leave the road without risking immobilization. Hit the lead vehicles, hit the rear vehicles, the entire column freezes. Now that convoy becomes what the file describes so vividly, a long, vulnerable ribbon of steel. Fire rains down from elevated positions. Rockets, mortars, and machine gun fire strike from above. The attackers know the ridgelines, the trails, the blind spots, the exit paths, and before a full response can form, they disappear back into terrain they know intimately. That is not melodrama, that is mountain warfare, and history is full of armies that learned too late that mountains do not care how expensive your equipment is. Mountains favor defenders, they always have. Worse still, the source argues that Iran has spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of war. Underground facilities, tunnel networks, pre-positioned caches, and hardened defensive systems built with patience, not panic. That matters because improvised defenses can collapse, prepared defenses endure, and when difficult terrain is combined with a prepared defender, the invading force faces not just tactical resistance, but strategic entrapment. The deeper it pushes, the harder it becomes to support. The harder it becomes to support, the more exposed it becomes. The more exposed it becomes, the more damaging even small disruptions can become. That is how a campaign starts bleeding strength faster than it gains ground. And while all of that is happening abroad, another battlefield opens at home. Politics. The source makes this point powerfully. War is not fought only on foreign soil. It is fought in the media, in economic data, in public opinion, in budgets, and in the minds of ordinary citizens, asking why they are being told to pay for a conflict with no clear endpoint. If casualties begin rising and costs begin exploding, public support can fracture rapidly. The file invokes Vietnam for exactly that reason. A war does not need to be lost militarily in the narrow sense to become politically unsustainable. It only needs to become bloody, expensive, and aimless enough that the public starts asking the most dangerous question any government can face. What exactly are we sacrificing all this for? And that question becomes even sharper in a society already under economic strain. Inflation, housing pressure, stagnant wages, and domestic instability create an environment in which a prolonged foreign ground war could become politically explosive. Why spend trillions on a grinding invasion while domestic needs go unmet? Why keep funding a conflict that keeps expanding while the promised victory never fully arrives? The file is right to treat domestic politics as part of the trap itself, because once public patience erodes, leaders are boxed into the worst kind of choice: escalate deeper into a failing strategy, or withdraw under the shadow of failure. Then comes the regional dimension, and this is where a hard war can become an uncontrollable one. Iran does not stand alone. The source stresses that it has developed networks of allied groups and partner organizations across the Middle East over decades. If American ground forces invade, those networks could activate quickly. Missile strikes, drone attacks, sabotage, attacks on bases, and disruption of shipping lanes could widen the battlefield far beyond Iran itself. Energy infrastructure, ports, refineries, pipelines, and power systems could all become targets. At that point, the war is no longer just a national campaign. It becomes a regional shockwave with global economic consequences: higher oil prices, disrupted supply chains, financial instability, and mounting pressure on every government that backed the operation. This is how strategic disasters expand, not because one battle is lost spectacularly, but because the war spills far beyond the assumptions used to sell it. And then there is the quieter danger, the one sophisticated strategists understand and careless ones ignore: the collapse of local trust. Foreign militaries depend on local intelligence to function in unfamiliar environments. They need intermediaries, guides, informants, and networks of cooperation. But those relationships are fragile. The file warns that once local actors begin to doubt the invader's ability to succeed, the flow of information can reverse. Routes once thought safe become fatal. Convoys are ambushed at their weakest moments. Patrols are anticipated. Bases come under relentless harassment. Soldiers begin to feel watched, mapped, and hunted. And once morale begins to collapse, equipment alone cannot save the mission. Morale is not decoration. Morale is combat power. So step back and look at the full picture. Scale makes the war hard to contain. Staging makes it hard to launch. Logistics make it hard to sustain. Mountains make movement predictable and vulnerable. Domestic politics make commitment fragile. Regional escalation widens the battlefield. Collapsing local trust makes the battlefield more dangerous from within. And each of these pressures amplifies the others. That is the true force of the Iran trap. It is not one problem. It is a system of problems, a machine of cumulative pressure tightening week by week. That is why the most dangerous moment in such a war might be the beginning. Because early battlefield success could create the illusion that the campaign is under control, when in fact the trap is only starting to close. And that is how great powers make historic mistakes, not because they are weak, but because they are strong enough to believe strength can override reality. But geography does not care about speeches. Logistics do not care about ideology. Domestic backlash does not care about military optimism. Regional blowback does not care about mission statements. Reality remains merciless. So the final question is not whether the United States could win battles inside Iran. It could. The final question is whether those victories would add up to anything lasting once geography, logistics, politics, regional escalation, and attritional warfare all begin pressing at once. And the answer suggested by this presentation is devastatingly clear. A ground invasion of Iran would not be a clean display of strength. It would be a strategic gamble built like a trap, one capable of draining resources, fracturing politics, widening the war, and leaving behind not triumph, but exhaustion, escalation, and regret.